The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as heavy boots thundered down the hallway of Lincoln High School. 3 police officers, their hands resting on their weapons, moved with urgent precision toward room 127. Behind them, Principal Martinez struggled to keep pace, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor like a frantic metronome. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the acrid scent of fear that had begun to permeate the building. "This is it," Martinez whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system. She fumbled with her master key, her hands trembling as she approached the door marked with a small placard, "Special Education Resource Room." Officer Johnson, a veteran with 20 years on the force, nodded grimly. His radio crackled with static, dispatchers coordinating the lockdown that was already beginning to ripple through the school like wildfire. Inside the classroom, 17-year-old Alex Chen sat at his usual desk in the back corner, methodically organizing his colored pencils by hue. His fingers moved with practiced precision, creating perfect rainbow patterns that somehow made sense in a world that rarely did. The routine brought him comfort, especially during the afternoon sessions when the hallways grew noisy and unpredictable. Alex had been coming to this room for 3 years, ever since his autism diagnosis had finally provided a name for the differences that had always set him apart. Mrs. Patterson, his special education teacher, had been preparing afternoon worksheets when she noticed the unusual silence in the corridors. At 54, she had developed an intuition for the subtle rhythms of school life. Something was wrong. The usual chatter of students changing classes had been replaced by an ominous quiet that made her skin crawl. She glanced at Alex, who continued his pencil arrangement, oblivious to the tension that was building like storm clouds beyond the classroom walls. The door burst open with a violence that shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Alex's pencils scattered across the floor, their carefully ordered arrangement destroyed in an instant. He pressed his hands against his ears, rocking slightly as the sensory overload threatened to overwhelm him. The sound of boots, the shouting voices, the harsh fluorescent glare reflecting off the officers' badges. It was all too much, too sudden, too wrong. "Alex Chen." Officer Johnson's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "We need you to come with us. Now." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her confusion. "What's going on? What's this about?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades advocating for vulnerable students. But even as she spoke, she could see the fear in Alex's eyes, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Ma'am, please step aside. We've received credible information about a planned attack. Alex Chen is a person of interest." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Alex's rocking intensified, his hands still pressed firmly against his ears. The world had become a kaleidoscope of confusion and terror. He didn't understand why these strangers were in his safe space, why their voices were so loud, why everything felt wrong. The pencils on the floor caught the light, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to mock the darkness that was descending upon his life. 3 hours earlier, Alex had been sitting in his 4th period English class, struggling to focus on the lesson about literary symbolism. The classroom was too bright, too noisy, filled with the constant rustle of papers and the whispered conversations of his classmates. He had learned to cope with these sensory challenges over the years, developing strategies that helped him navigate the overwhelming environment of high school. But today felt different. Today, the whispers seemed more pointed, the glances more hostile. Karen Whitmore sat 3 rows ahead, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. At 42, she had volunteered as a classroom aide for the past 2 years, ostensibly to help students with special needs. But those who knew her well understood that Karen's motivations were far more complex than simple altruism. She craved attention, validation, The feeling of being important in a world that had largely forgotten her since her divorce 3 years ago. Karen had been watching Alex for months, cataloging his behaviors, his routines, his vulnerabilities. She had seen how he struggled with social interactions, how he often muttered to himself when overwhelmed, how he sometimes drew violent imagery as a way to process his frustrations. In Karen's twisted worldview, these were not the coping mechanisms of a young man dealing with autism. They were warning signs of something far more sinister. The breaking point had come during lunch. Alex had been sitting alone, as usual, when a group of seniors had decided to have some fun at his expense. They had surrounded his table, mocking his careful eating habits, his need to have his food items separated on his tray. One of them had grabbed his sandwich, tossing it across the cafeteria while the others laughed. Alex had stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Leave me alone," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a desperation that cut through the cafeteria noise. "Please, just leave me alone." Karen had witnessed the entire incident from her position at the volunteer check-in desk. She had seen Alex's reaction, the way his body had tensed, the raw emotion in his voice. To most observers, it would have been clear that Alex was a victim, a young man pushed to his breaking point by cruel bullies. But Karen saw something else entirely. She saw an opportunity. That afternoon, while Alex attended his special education class, Karen had slipped into his locker. She had obtained the combination weeks earlier, claiming she needed to check on his medications for the school nurse. The locker was meticulously organized, just as she had expected. Books arranged by subject, supplies in labeled containers, everything in its proper place. It was almost too easy. From her purse, Karen had retrieved a small notebook, one she had purchased specifically for this purpose. Inside, she had written detailed plans for a school shooting, complete with diagrams of the building, lists of potential targets, and inflammatory statements about revenge against bullies. The handwriting was deliberately crude, mimicking the style of someone trying to disguise their penmanship. She had even included references to Alex's autism, framing it as a source of rage and social isolation. The second piece of evidence was even more damning. Karen had printed several pages of bomb-making instructions from the internet, along with a shopping list of chemicals that could theoretically be used to create explosive devices. She had been careful to use a computer at the local library, paying cash for the printing, ensuring that nothing could be traced back to her. The papers were folded and placed beneath Alex's chemistry textbook, positioned so they would be easily discovered during a search. Karen's phone call to 911 had been a masterpiece of manipulation. Her voice had trembled with carefully practiced fear as she reported seeing Alex with suspicious materials in his locker. She had described the notebook, the printed pages, the disturbing drawings she claimed to have seen him working on. She had painted a picture of a lonely, angry young man on the verge of violence, someone who needed to be stopped before tragedy struck. "Please, you have to believe me," she had whispered into the phone, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments. "I work with these kids every day. I know the signs. Alex is planning something terrible. I found evidence in his locker. He's been acting strange, talking about revenge. I'm scared for everyone here." Now, as the police officers surrounded Alex in his classroom, Karen stood in the hallway, watching through the small window in the door. Her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. She had set the wheels in motion, and there was no going back. Part of her felt a twinge of guilt as she watched Alex's obvious distress. But she pushed those feelings aside. She was protecting the school, she told herself. She was a hero. The lockdown announcement crackled through the intercom system. Principal Martinez's voice strained with the weight of her words. "Teachers and students, please remain in your classrooms. We are implementing emergency protocols. Follow your safety procedures and remain calm. The words echoed through empty hallways as hundreds of students and faculty members huddled behind locked doors, their phones buzzing with urgent messages to worried parents. In room 127, Alex had been handcuffed and was being led toward the door. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as if his body was fighting against his own nervous system. Mrs. Patterson followed close behind, her face pale with shock and disbelief. She had worked with Alex for 3 years, had seen him grow from a frightened 14-year-old into a young man who was slowly learning to navigate the world on his own terms. The idea that he could be planning violence was not just wrong, it was impossible. "This is insane," she muttered to Principal Martinez as they walked down the hallway. "Alex wouldn't hurt a fly. He gets upset when he accidentally steps on an ant. There has to be some mistake." But mistakes were luxuries that law enforcement couldn't afford when dealing with potential school violence. The officers had been trained to act first and investigate later, to treat every threat as credible until proven otherwise. The evidence in Alex's locker had been damning. The notebook filled with violent fantasies, the bomb-making instructions, the detailed plans for an attack. It didn't matter that Alex had never shown any signs of aggression, that his disabilities made him more likely to be a victim than a perpetrator. The evidence spoke for itself. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived at the school 20 minutes after the initial call. At 38, she had been investigating crimes for 15 years, developing an instinct for truth that rarely led her astray. She had handled dozens of cases involving threats against schools, and she knew that the vast majority turned out to be false alarms, misunderstandings, or cries for help rather than genuine plans for violence. But she also knew that the one time she was wrong, people could die. The evidence room at the school had been transformed into a makeshift investigation center. The items from Alex's locker were spread across a table, photographed from multiple angles, cataloged with forensic precision. Detective Morrison examined each piece carefully, looking for clues that might reveal the truth behind the accusations. The notebook was particularly troubling. The writing was crude but detailed, showing a level of planning that suggested serious intent. But something nagged at her. The handwriting seemed inconsistent, as if the author had been trying to disguise their natural penmanship. The paper was too new, too clean, for something that had supposedly been written over time. The bomb-making instructions were generic, the kind of information that could be found on any extremist website, but they showed no signs of being studied or annotated. It was as if someone had simply printed them out and placed them in the locker. At the police station, Alex sat in an interrogation room, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had stopped rocking, stopped making any movement at all, as if he had retreated deep inside himself, where the outside world couldn't reach him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face. He had been read his rights, but the words had washed over him like water, meaningless sounds in a world that no longer made sense. Detective Morrison entered the room slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She had dealt with autistic individuals before and understood that aggressive interrogation tactics would only make things worse. She sat down across from Alex, her voice gentle but firm. "Alex, I'm Detective Morrison. I need to ask you some questions about what we found in your locker. Can you look at me?" Alex's eyes remained fixed on the floor, but his breathing quickened slightly. He understood that he was in serious trouble, but he couldn't comprehend why. The items they had shown him were foreign, alien things that had no place in his carefully ordered world. He had never seen the notebook before, had never printed bomb-making instructions, had never planned to hurt anyone. But how could he explain that when the evidence seemed to prove otherwise? "I didn't write those things," he whispered finally, his voice so quiet that Detective Morrison had to lean forward to hear him. "I don't know where they came from. I don't want to hurt anyone." Meanwhile, back at the school, Karen was being interviewed by Officer Johnson. She sat in the principal's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red from what appeared to be tears of distress. She had perfected her story during the hours since making the 911 call, adding details that would make her account more credible, more compelling. "I've been worried about Alex for weeks," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's been drawing violent pictures, talking about getting revenge on the kids who pick on him. I tried to talk to his teacher, but she said it was just his way of coping. I should have pushed harder. I should have reported it sooner." Mrs. Patterson, who had been called in to provide her perspective, shook her head in disbelief. "That's not true. Alex has never drawn violent pictures in my class. He draws landscapes, animals, abstract patterns. He's never talked about revenge or hurting anyone." "Karen, I don't understand why you're saying these things." The confrontation between the two women was brief, but intense. Karen's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder, more calculating beneath the surface. But she quickly recovered, her expression returning to one of wounded innocence. "I'm just trying to protect everyone," Karen said, her voice rising slightly. "I saw what I saw. I know what I know. Maybe you're too close to the situation to see it clearly." The school remained in lockdown for the rest of the day, while police continued their investigation. Parents gathered outside the building, their faces etched with worry and confusion. Local news crews arrived, setting up their cameras and microphones, hungry for details about the latest school violence scare. Social media exploded with speculation and rumors. Alex's name and photographs circulating among people who had never met him, but felt qualified to judge his guilt or innocence. David Chen, Alex's father, received the call at his downtown law office. The words hit him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. His son, his gentle, artistic son who cried when he accidentally stepped on a beetle, was being accused of planning a school shooting. The irony was not lost on him. As a criminal defense attorney, he had spent years defending clients accused of crimes they didn't commit. Now his own son was caught in the same web of circumstantial evidence and public hysteria. Linda Chen, Alex's mother, had been in the middle of a parent-teacher conference at her elementary school when the principal had pulled her aside. The drive to the police station had been a blur of tears and frantic phone calls. She kept thinking about the morning, how Alex had carefully packed his lunch, how he had reminded her about his art therapy appointment after school. These were not the actions of someone planning violence. They were the routines of a young man trying to make sense of a complicated world. The interrogation continued for hours, but Alex remained consistent in his denials. He couldn't explain how the evidence had gotten into his locker, couldn't provide an alibi for every moment of the day, couldn't understand why someone would want to frame him for something so terrible. His lawyer, a colleague of his father's who specialized in cases involving mental health issues, arrived to find Alex in a state of complete shutdown, his usual coping mechanisms overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. As evening fell, Detective Morrison found herself increasingly troubled by the case. The evidence was compelling on the surface, but the deeper she dug, the more inconsistencies she found. The timeline didn't quite work. Alex had been in supervised classes for most of the day, with little opportunity to access his locker unobserved. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, with experts noting several irregularities that suggested possible forgery. Most importantly, Alex's psychological profile was completely inconsistent with someone capable of planning mass violence. The breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m., when Detective Morrison decided to review the school security footage. Lincoln High School had installed a comprehensive surveillance system 2 years earlier, with cameras covering every hallway, entrance, and common area. If Alex had been planning something, if he had been acting suspiciously, there would be evidence on tape. What she found instead was something entirely different. The footage showed Alex's daily routines in perfect detail: arriving at school, going to classes, eating lunch alone, spending time in the special education room. But it also showed something else. At 2:17 p.m., while Alex was in his supervised study period, the camera captured Karen Whitmore approaching his locker. She looked around nervously, then quickly opened the lock and reached inside. Detective Morrison watched the footage 3 times, her anger growing with each viewing. Karen had planted the evidence, had deliberately framed a vulnerable young man for one of the most serious crimes imaginable. The realization was sickening, not just because of the cruelty involved, but because of how easily it had nearly worked. Alex could have been charged with terrorist threats, could have spent years in prison, could have had his life completely destroyed by one woman's twisted need for attention. The arrest warrant for Karen Whitmore was issued at 6:30 a.m. the following morning. Detective Morrison personally led the team that went to her modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Karen answered the door in her bathrobe, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine surprise. She had been expecting praise for her vigilance, perhaps a commendation for preventing a tragedy. Instead, she found herself facing federal charges for filing false reports, planting evidence, and making terroristic threats. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "I was trying to help. I was trying to protect everyone. Alex is dangerous. You have to believe me." But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage showed her planting the materials in Alex's locker. Her fingerprints were on the notebook and the printed pages. Her computer records showed that she had researched bomb-making techniques and school shooting protocols in the weeks leading up to the incident. Most damning of all, her own social media posts revealed a pattern of attention-seeking behavior and a growing obsession with Alex's daily routines. The FBI became involved when it became clear that Karen's actions constituted a federal crime. Agent Rebecca Torres, a specialist in domestic terrorism cases, took over the investigation. She had seen similar cases before: individuals who created false threats to generate attention or to frame others for personal vendettas. But the targeting of a disabled student added an extra layer of cruelty that made the case particularly disturbing. Agent Torres interviewed Karen at the Federal Detention Center, finding her to be a complex mix of delusion and calculation. Karen continued to insist that she had been protecting the school, that Alex was genuinely dangerous, that the evidence spoke for itself. But when pressed for details, her story began to fall apart. She couldn't explain why she had been in Alex's locker, couldn't account for her fingerprints on the evidence, couldn't justify her extensive research into explosive devices. "He's different," Karen said finally, her mask of concern slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. "He doesn't belong with normal kids. He makes everyone uncomfortable. I was just trying to get him the help he needs." The words hung in the air like a poison, revealing the true motivation behind Karen's actions. It wasn't about preventing violence or protecting students. It was about eliminating someone who didn't fit her narrow definition of normal. Alex's autism had made him a target, his differences marking him as someone who could be easily scapegoated and removed from the community she wanted to protect. Alex was released from custody 18 hours after his arrest, but the damage to his life was immediate and profound. His name had been leaked to the media, his photograph plastered across social media platforms with accusations of planned violence. Death threats filled his family's voicemail. Protesters gathered outside their home, demanding that he be expelled from school or institutionalized. The presumption of innocence, so fundamental to the American justice system, had been abandoned in favor of mob justice and viral condemnation. The Chen family held a press conference 3 days after Alex's release, their lawyer flanked by autism advocates and civil rights attorneys. David Chen spoke with quiet dignity about his son's ordeal, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Linda Chen sat beside him, her eyes red from crying, her protective instincts on full display as she glared at the assembled reporters. "My son is not a criminal," David said, his words carrying the weight of a father's love and a lawyer's precision. "He is a 17-year-old boy with autism who was victimized by someone who should have been protecting him. The real crime here is not what Alex allegedly planned to do. It's what Karen Whitmore actually did." The community response was swift and divided. Many residents were horrified by the revelation that an innocent young man had been framed, that their rush to judgment had nearly destroyed a life. But others remained skeptical, unable to fully accept that their initial fears had been manufactured. The damage to Alex's reputation was proving harder to repair than the legal charges had been to dismiss. At Lincoln High School, the revelation of Karen's deception sent shockwaves through the faculty and student body. Mrs. Patterson, who had been vindicated in her assessment of Alex's character, found herself angry at a system that had been so quick to accept the word of a volunteer over the professional judgment of a trained educator. Principal Martinez faced calls for her resignation, critics arguing that she had failed to protect a vulnerable student from a predator within the school system. The trial of Karen Whitmore began 6 months later, drawing national attention to the case. The prosecution, led by federal prosecutor James Morrison, painted a picture of a woman whose need for attention had driven her to commit an unconscionable act against an innocent young man. The defense argued that Karen had genuinely believed Alex was dangerous, that her actions were misguided but not criminal. The courtroom was packed with autism advocates, civil rights activists, and members of the local community. Alex testified on his own behalf, his voice quiet but clear as he described the terror and confusion of being arrested for crimes he had never contemplated. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. He spoke of his love for art, his difficulty with social interactions, his dreams of becoming a graphic designer. He was, the jury realized, exactly what he appeared to be, a young man trying to navigate a world that didn't always understand him. Karen's testimony was equally revealing, though in a very different way. Under cross-examination, she revealed her true feelings about Alex and students like him. She spoke of her belief that disabled students were disruptive, that they made normal students uncomfortable, that they required too many resources and accommodations. Her words painted a picture of someone whose prejudices had festered into something dark and dangerous. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Karen was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, a punishment that reflected both the seriousness of her crimes and the harm she had caused to Alex and his family. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke eloquently about the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to override justice and compassion. Ms. Whitmore, your actions represent a betrayal of the most fundamental principles of our society, the judge said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. You targeted a vulnerable young man, not because of any threat he posed, but because of your own inability to accept differences in others. Your crime was not just against Alex Chen. It was against the entire community you claimed to be protecting. The aftermath of the trial brought both vindication and continued challenges for Alex and his family. The legal victory had cleared his name, but the social media age meant that false accusations could follow someone forever. They received thousands of messages of support from around the world, but also continued threats from those who refused to accept his innocence. Alex returned to Lincoln High School the following fall, but the experience had changed him profoundly. He was more withdrawn, more cautious in his interactions with others. The trust he had slowly built in the adult world had been shattered, replaced by a wariness that colored every new relationship. Mrs. Patterson worked tirelessly to help him rebuild his confidence, but the scars of his ordeal remained visible to those who knew him best. The school implemented new policies in response to the incident, including enhanced background checks for volunteers and mandatory training on disability awareness. They also created a support group for students with special needs, recognizing that Alex's experience had highlighted the vulnerability of disabled students to both bullying and false accusations. 3 years later, Alex graduated from high school with honors, his artistic talents having flourished despite the trauma he had endured. He had been accepted to several art schools, his portfolio demonstrating both technical skill and an emotional depth that spoke to his unique perspective on the world. The boy who had been labeled as dangerous had become a young man whose creativity and gentleness inspired everyone who knew him. At his graduation ceremony, Alex was awarded a special recognition for courage and perseverance. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. It was a moment of redemption, not just for Alex, but for a community that had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of protecting its most vulnerable members. Mrs. Patterson, now retired, attended the ceremony with tears in her eyes. She had dedicated her career to advocating for students like Alex, but his case had shown her both the fragility of the systems designed to protect them and the strength of the human spirit in overcoming injustice. As she watched him accept his diploma, she knew that her work had been worthwhile. Karen Whitmore remained in federal prison, her appeal having been denied. The other inmates knew her story, and she had quickly discovered that those who target children, even falsely, are not welcomed in the prison community. She spent her days in protective custody, isolated from the general population, with plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had brought her there. The case had broader implications beyond the immediate participants. It became a catalyst for discussions about disability rights, the presumption of innocence, and the dangers of social media mob justice. Law enforcement agencies across the country revised their protocols for dealing with school threat allegations, recognizing the need for more thorough investigation before taking dramatic action. Alex Chen went on to art school, where he studied graphic design and found his voice as an artist. His work often explored themes of difference and acceptance, using his unique perspective to create pieces that challenged viewers to examine their own prejudices. He became an advocate for autism awareness, speaking at conferences and schools about his experiences and the importance of understanding rather than fearing those who are different. The story of Alex Chen and Karen Whitmore became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to override justice and compassion. It demonstrated how easily an innocent person could be destroyed by false accusations, and how important it was for communities to protect their most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their differences. Years later, as Alex established himself as a successful artist and advocate, he would often reflect on the events that had nearly destroyed his life. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also taught him about the strength of the human spirit and the importance of standing up for what is right. He had learned that justice, while sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail, and that even in the darkest moments, there were always people willing to fight for truth and fairness. The fluorescent lights that had flickered in room 127 on that terrible day had been replaced with softer, more welcoming illumination. The room was now dedicated to Alex's memory, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had overcome injustice and found his way to a brighter future. It served as a reminder that every student, regardless of their differences, deserved protection, understanding, and the chance to reach their full potential. In the end, the story of Alex Chen was not just about one young man's ordeal. It was about the capacity of communities to learn from their mistakes, to grow from their failures, and to become better protectors of those who needed their help most. It was a story of darkness overcome by light, of lies defeated by truth, and of the enduring power of justice to heal even the deepest wounds. The pencils that had scattered across the floor that day had been carefully collected and returned to Alex. He kept them in a special case, a reminder of how quickly life could change and how important it was to never take safety and security for granted. Sometimes he would arrange them in their rainbow patterns, finding the same comfort in order and beauty that had sustained him through his darkest hour. They had become symbols, not of his vulnerability, but of his resilience, proof that even when the world seemed to fall apart, it was possible to put the pieces back together and create something beautiful from the chaos.